Close your eyes and listen, not to the roar of the crowd, not to the sting of the nails. Listen to the silence of a single woman standing at the edge of an abyss. What frightens us more, the scream of despair or the absolute stillness of someone forbidden to weep? The world looks at the Virgin Mary beneath the cross and sees divine acceptance, immaculate holiness. But this is not the story of dogma. This is the tragedy of the Mother Archetype, pushed to its breaking point. In her silence, there was no passivity, only a psychological paradox forcing her to betray the deepest part of her being, the human mother. Here is your permission to look behind the mask of perfection. Through the lens of Carl Jung, we unravel what Mary's silence truly concealed. She carried the weight of her collective persona, the facade of purity the world demanded, while her shadow cried out for her to intervene, to rupture destiny itself. Her dilemma mirrors our own. The moment when the logos, law, reason, fate, demands the brutal sacrifice of our Eros, our unconditional love, our most intimate feeling. Mary was being pulled between her divine honor and her maternal heart. Her journey becomes a powerful metaphor for the search for wholeness, the self, the courage to hold the wisdom of union, the human mother and the archetypal one, woven together. It is a call to rescue the inner voice, silenced by the world's expectations. If you have ever swallowed your pain just to maintain the illusion of strength, if you seek to understand how grief can transform into spiritual authority, then this is not a journey to face alone. Subscribe now to Shadow Work Stories so YouTube understands the depth of this work and continues guiding you on your own path of individuation. Leave your like, and let us unveil the mystery of the silence that hides the greatest force of all. To understand Mary's silence, we must first understand what Carl Jung called the persona. The persona is not who you are. It is the mask society demands you wear in order to be accepted, the work uniform of the psyche, the role you perform to survive the gaze of the world. But in Mary's case, this mask was colossal. She had become the vessel of society's perfection, the Mother of God, the Immaculate Virgin. The culture of her time needed her to embody total acceptance, a silent submission to divine will. Her persona was the idealized Great Mother Archetype. The tragedy is that beneath this archetypal mask lived a woman, a human mother, enduring a pain too brutal to name. The violence inflicted on Mary was not physical, it was psychological. Society stripped her of complexity, refusing to see her as a whole woman. She was flattened into a single-dimensional symbol, and that symbol allowed only one behavior: stoic acceptance. If Mary had screamed, if grief had ruptured her restraint, the collective persona would have shattered. Dogma could not risk the collapse of its highest icon, tainted by hysteria, touched by rebellion. Silence became the cost of her sanctity. Silence became the proof that she lived up to the role, even as that same silence was killing the mother beneath it. Ironically, Mary carried the archetypal burden of the repressed sacred feminine, while Mary Magdalene bore the collective shadow of the sinner, the dark projection of the feminine. Mary, The mother carried the excess of light, the projection of purity. Both women imprisoned by labels. Mary could not show her rage, her despair, because those feelings had been exiled into the shadow. And what society condemns in itself, its fear of emotional chaos, its terror of questioning authority, was projected onto her as something the Divine Mother would never feel. Her persona was in truth a collective defense mechanism, shielding the world from its own inability to confront deep, unbearable grief. By clinging to the persona of the perfect mother, Mary became trapped in the relentless tension between the truth of herself, the mother desperate to save her son, and the lie of her imposed persona, the saint who accepts destiny. She stood at a crossroads of agony. Society demanded silence, logos, but her body and soul demanded the scream, Eros. And in that brutal collision where a mother's pain meets divine fate lies the true key to her strength. She needed her inner reason to confirm the truth her heart already knew. But how can one integrate God's reason, logos, when one's love, Eros, is being crucified? What then was Mary's deepest act of courage? To scream, or to remain in a silence that felt like a betrayal of her own heart? The silence of Mary at the foot of the cross is not the absence of sound. It is the deafening echo of an archetypal collision. It is the cry of Eros, the principle of connection, of feeling, of unconditional love, being swallowed by Logos, the principle of order, law, hierarchical reason, and destiny itself. In Jung's analytical psychology, Eros is the force of bonding and relationship, the visceral maternal human thread tying Mary to her son. Logos, on the other hand, is the blade of separation, discernment, structure, the quiet voice whispering, "This is the plan, this is the law, you must not interfere." The indomitable force of the mother, Eros, demanded the most primal act, to fight, to scream, to intervene, to pull her child out of suffering. But the imposed logos, the divine script, the weight of prophetic destiny, demanded that she betray this ancient instinct. This tension was her private crucifixion. Mary's psyche became a battlefield between the law of God and the love of a mother. To grasp the magnitude of this repression, we must see the culture rising around her. The emerging dogma was rigid, rational, structured, deeply masculine, the reign of an unyielding logos. This principle feared above all the raw power of Eros, intuition, feeling, direct connection, and especially the sacred force of the feminine. If Mary yielded to her Eros, if she broke down in grief, if she openly protested, she would align herself with everything the system sought to suppress, the emotional power of the feminine. She would be called too emotional, unstable, hysterical, the very labels Logos uses to silence the truth of Eros. The system needed her to affirm destiny, not to question it with her heart. So her silence, mistaken for a failure of Eros, was a desperate attempt to satisfy the external Logos and preserve the meaning of the sacrifice. She wore the collective persona like armor, protecting the message from being shattered by her own pain. Mary's act is unbearably complex. She had to force her Eros to obey Logos. This is not passive resignation. It is an inner alchemy. She was trying to fuse the opposites within herself, to use the strength of Logos, discernment, the rising animus, to accept the truth her heart, Eros, the anima, already knew, that death was only a passage. Her silence was her attempt at wholeness, a refusal to let pain tear her apart. Had she only screamed, she would have been reduced to wild Eros, a tragic and hysterical figure. Had she only submitted, she would have become cold Logos, inhuman and distant. The pain of acceptance, the pain of watching her son suffer with no power to intervene, is the fire that fuses these principles. She needs her inner reason, an animus forged in suffering, to confirm the intuitive truth her anima had long sensed. This is the search for totality, the self, the union of the masculine and feminine within the soul. Yet this forced reconciliation demands a terrible price: the sacrifice of personal feeling. By silencing the maternal impulse to save her child, Mary does not kill the instinct. She buries it. She pushes it into the shadow. A necessary act, but a devastating one, a quiet form of psychic self-violence. Mary's grief is not the grief of someone who resigns easily. It is the grief of one who knows that the deepest love, the archetypal Eros, requires surrender to the logos of destiny. She struggles to bend her human will to a will greater than her own, and this struggle is what makes her the bearer of wholeness. Her Eros does not buy, it is transmuted. It ceases to be the passionate love for the physical son and begins to transform into the love-wisdom for the archetype he embodies. But this transformation brings her to the edge, for she must embrace the shadow of inaction. Mary succeeded in forcing her Eros to obey Logos, but the sacrifice of her maternal instinct left a storm in her psyche, the shadow of inaction. If she was the chosen one, if her faith was unshakable, why didn't she try to stop it? Why did she allow the tragedy? And so we descend into the darkest chamber of her soul, the shadow of inaction, the guilt of the human mother, the instinct she was forced to repress, and discover how accepting this darkness became the true catalyst for her final authority. We've seen the epic conflict in which Mary summoned the force of Logos, reason, destiny, to silence her Eros, the raw maternal instinct of love. But every repression of a vital psychic energy demands a price, and that price, in Jung psychology, is the shadow. The shadow is the vast vault of traits, impulses, instincts, the ego, and above all, the collective persona of the Immaculate Mother refuses to accept. For Mary, the shadow was not evil. It was her unresolved humanity, the animal instinctive mother within her who demanded her child's survival above any divine decree. What was Mary's shadow? The anger at being chosen for such unbearable pain, the impulse to curse destiny, the primitive wish to be imperfect, to fail at her divine role, and above all, guilt, the shadow of inaction, the cruel whisper, "What if I could have done more?" The guilt of the human mother is primordial, the wound of failing to protect her child. Mary's persona, the saint who accepts, commanded her to know that all of this was part of the plan. But her human soul wrestled with the deeper question: why did my Logos outweigh my Eros? Did I betray my son by choosing the role over the instinct? This doubt, this shadow, was exactly what the world forced her to bury. By silencing the instinct to fight and maintaining her sacred stillness, she was, quite literally, pushing her shadow of inaction into the unconscious. What the society punished on the cross, the possibility of rebellion against authority, was the very impulse she had to kill within herself simply to survive her role. The world could not bear the thought that the Mother of God might feel the despair of any ordinary mother. Such humanity would destabilize the collective faith. And so the civilization's own collective shadow, its fear of emotional chaos, its fear of fragile faith, was projected back onto Mary as a mandatory silence. She needed to be the rock, even while she was collapsing inside. This forced repression of her instinct to fight created a void of choice within her. She did not act, yet the shadow of inaction stalked her. You are the mother, you carried the divine, and you cowered before the law. This was the cruel whisper of her own unconscious. This was not a moral dilemma, it was the existential crisis of the ego. For the ego, the center of consciousness, wants to fight, to choose, to prove it was right. But by accepting destiny, logos, Mary forced the ego to kneel before the self, the totality. Though archetypally correct, the ego felt this surrender as failure, as guilt. Mary had to become the perfect victim for the dogma, and the perfect mother for her own ego. She was trapped between the judgment of the persona outside and the judgment of the shadow within. This endless tension kept her from shattering. She was so consumed with dissolving her own guilt that she had no energy left for despair. Yet it is precisely in this brutal confrontation with her shadow that the key to her final strength is found. Mary's story is not passive tragedy, it is the ignition of individuation. Attacked by the tyranny of her own idealized persona and tortured by the quiet guilt of her shadow, she was forced to dive deep into her unconscious, to find a source of truth immune both to external judgment and internal shame. Her silence transformed, no longer repression, but concentration, a retreat into the only place the collective shadow could not reach. What the world wished to punish, weakness, despair, her soul was ready to integrate. By facing the shadow of inaction and removing the burden of guilt from herself, Mary prepared for the final act of her humanity. She saw that the guilt was never hers. It was the colossal lie the world used to steal her human soul. To accept her imperfection became her healing. By integrating the shadow of inaction, Mary was ready to become whole. But then came the most terrifying void, the physical death of her son. He who had been the beacon of her purpose, the catalyst of herself, was gone. Who was Mary without the son? And how could a woman whose identity and destiny were woven around him find totality in a world where her outer purpose had disappeared? Mary had survived the crucifixion and integrated the shadow of inaction. But now she faced the final, most terrifying consequence for the ego, the absence of the physical. The one who had been the beacon of her purpose, the catalyst of herself, the anchor of her truth, was gone. The emptiness of the tomb was not a riddle for reason to solve. It was a psychological command. It whispered, "Wholeness is not outside. Wholeness is within you." This was the true turning point in the narrative of Mary's soul. For the psychic energy she had projected outward now needed to be withdrawn and brought home. Carl Jung would say that the son, in his archetypal form, had completed his role as guide to the self. While he walked beside her in flesh, there was always the danger that Mary would project her own inner divinity onto him. The body had to vanish so she could discover the spirit, the essence within herself. Wholeness could no longer be carried by an object of attachment. The loss of the projection object, the sun, ignites the most painful stage, the dark night of the soul, or, in Jungian terms, the confrontation with the void of certainty. This is the moment when the seeker must face the possibility that her entire spiritual journey was built on an illusion. The one who had been her refuge, her source of authority, her purpose, was no longer there. The void awakened the primordial fear, the fear of irrevocable abandonment. Not only the loss of a body, but the terror of being abandoned by truth itself. What if my gnosis, my intuitive knowing, was only hysteria as society claimed? What if the wholeness I felt was nothing more than my desperate need for meaning? This fear is the ego's final maneuver, clinging to the safety of an external source of power. The logos of doubt tried to convince her that without concrete proof, there could be no truth. Mary now had to show that her faith rested in her inner experience, not in an outer figure. The void she felt forced her to withdraw the projection, a painful but necessary step toward individuation. But Mary had become the pilgrim, and the pilgrim knows that the only map is the unconscious. Crisis deepened into acceptance. She was required to confront the shadow of being utterly alone, the understanding that truth is often a lonely path, a path walked by few. Most turn back to the comfort of dogma. Mary, however, had tasted wholeness. Her surrender to the void was not defeat, but the final victory over the fear of not belonging. She saw that the fear of emptiness was just the final illusion. By yielding to it, she found fullness. She stopped searching for proof in the past and opened herself to the flow of the future, to the path her anima, her intuition, had been calling her toward. Mary's grief then transmuted into gnosis, direct knowledge. She understood that the event of the resurrection was not a single miracle, but the archetypal pattern of psychic transformation, the union of opposites, life emerging from death, light rising from the shadow. She saw the language of the unconscious unfolding in the world around her. The transmutation of her pain was the final act of her individuation, the long walk toward becoming whole. What the world perceived as solitude, Mary internalized as absolute authority. She had no temple. Her body was the temple. She had no sermon. Her life was the sermon. The command "Noli me tangere" echoed through her soul. It was not only a call to avoid clinging to the Master's former body, but a command not to cling to her former self, the self that depended on external authority to validate her faith. She had become the source, the center, the feminine self in motion. She became living proof that revelation is personal, intimate, and immune to hierarchy. Mary's path was no longer Galilee or Jerusalem. Her path was mythopoesis, the creation of a personal myth of freedom and authenticity. She became the legend her own unconscious demanded. By accepting the void, she filled it with her essence. She became wholeness. Mary had become her own authority by surviving the emptiness, but this new self-generated authority now had to be tested against the rigid, skeptical logos of the world. How would she wield this newly awakened force in a world still ruled by the austerity of the apostles, men who sought concrete proof and clung to the dominion of the masculine? In the archetypal void, Mary was forced to become her own source of authority. In Jungian terms, she had to integrate the animus, the masculine dimension of the feminine psyche, the force of reason, discernment, action, objectivity, and spiritual authority. Society and the dogma that trapped her within a persona had tried not only to repress her anima, intuition and feeling, but also to disqualify her animus, insisting that a woman could only receive truth through a male intermediary. Her challenge was immense. She had to validate her intuitive knowing, her gnosis, in the face of the external logos, law, reason, hierarchy. The strength Mary used to stand upright and witness the tragedy was never superficial resignation. It was the masculine principle within her claiming its place. Her extreme grief forced her to develop clarity and discernment, gifts of the animus. She did not seek the approval of the apostles. She sought the approval of her own mind. She needed her inner reason to confirm the truth her heart, her Eros, already knew. This integration is what set her apart. While the world around her clung to the logic of loss and the comfort of dogma, Mary wove faith and reason into one thread. Her experience was gnoseological, rooted in direct knowledge of the soul. To carry a message of wholeness, her animus could not remain passive. It had to be transformed, sharpened, making her capable of standing firm against the inertia of fear and doubt. Integrated, her animus transformed her into the archetype of the whole woman. In this story, the whole mother. She did not oppose the masculine principle of order. She absorbed it and balanced it with her profound feeling, her Eros. This was the final proof of her wisdom, and the reason she did not collapse into despair. Her power was internal, and therefore immune to death and to external dogma. Mary had proven her worth to herself by integrating her animus. She held a certainty that only the soul can grant. She was ready to carry the message. But holding wholeness in a fragmented world is a heavy burden. A final doubt hovered over her. Would integrating this strength turn her rigid and isolated, just like the dogma that once condemned her? Her mission now was to prove that authority can coexist with compassion. She had to become the first to show that true strength lives in totality, in the union of heart and mind. And this test, the test of protecting intuitive truth in the face of skeptical reason, was about to take form. Mary had found her authority, but the world, even those meant to be her companions in faith, was not ready for such totality. While she stood on the ground of gnosis, they clung to the ground of logos. That cruel divide would lead her to a final confrontation with the rigidity of dogma itself. A moment of separation where she would again be labeled too emotional or visionary. New names for the same ancient rejection. Mary had integrated her animus, her inner authority, and embraced her anima, her intuition. She had reached the wholeness of herself. Yet the world, and even those closest to her, were not ready for such completeness. Instead, they rejected her. This rejection did not come from the old collective shadow that once condemned women as sinners. It came from the skepticism and disbelief of the disciples themselves. They sought proof, the factual evidence demanded by logos. Mary, however, carried certainty, the intuitive experience of Eros. Her knowing was personal, interior, and therefore impossible to reduce to the rules and proofs they demanded. This moment of separation was cruel, but essential. Mary realized that the truth she carried could never be validated by those still trapped in the duality of the mind. Her former companions, still searching for authority outside themselves, projected onto her not malice, but incomprehension. They saw her as too emotional or visionary, new labels for the same ancient rejection of the sacred feminine. Remember, dogma has always feared Eros, feeling, intuition, and has tried to subjugate it under the hierarchical logos. By dismissing Mary's certainty, they were unconsciously reaffirming the old patriarchal structure. Mary was forced into a radical decision to abandon the need to be believed. Her path could no longer follow the collective. It had to become the path of gnosis, direct knowledge of the soul. This was the moment of radical self-acceptance. She accepted that her truth was hers alone, that her own approval was the only authority that mattered. Her journey into solitude was not abandonment, but preservation of the self. By stepping away, she guarded the purity of the message from the distortions of dogma. The emptiness that followed was not an emptiness of meaning, but an emptiness of external dependence. Hierarchy dissolved. She became her own spiritual authority, the archetype of the pilgrim, the woman who carries sacred truth across the world. By separating herself, she fulfilled her own inner command. She released the last remnant of her need for masculine validation. She accepted her shadow, the sinner, the emotional one, integrated her animus, reason and authority, and listened to her anima, intuition and feeling. The wholeness she attained, herself, was the only true inheritance she carried from the resurrection. Her mission became to carry the legacy of feeling. Her message was meant for those who seek truth through the heart, through experience, through intuition. She became the living source of a wisdom that could never be codified in law. Mary Magdalene became the proof that the greatest strength of any individual is the capacity to remain whole in a world that demands fragmentation. Mary had freed herself from the need to be validated by the world. But wholeness in a fragmented world is unsustainable. Where would she take her wisdom? Where would the liberated sacred feminine lead her next? The answer lived in the legends, in the wisdom of the earth, and in the guidance that only a liberated self can hear. Mary had stepped away from the outer world, but what happened to the love that once defined her? Grief transformed her love as passion, the attachment to the physical presence of the sun, into love as wisdom. Eros, once bound to an external form, now turned inward and expanded. In its archetypal expression, the sun had represented the self, wholeness, the path toward the union of opposites, masculine and feminine, reason and intuition. The depth of her connection allowed her to witness the resurrection on a level that transcended the physical, the level of the soul. She did not need historical proof, she carried psychological proof. The emptiness of the tomb forced her psyche to understand that what had died was the body, but the archetype was eternal. She no longer mourned the loss, she perceived the pattern beneath it, the wholeness it symbolized. Her mission was not to lament the event, but to embody the archetype of resurrection. This freed her from dogma. She needed no rules. She had the experience itself. The wholeness she felt was the union of the sacred feminine, Eros, with the spiritual masculine, Logos. She became living proof that integration is possible. There was no longer separation between body and soul, only completeness. What the world sought as a miracle, Mary understood as a psychic process. And that is why she was the first chosen to carry the message, because she alone was prepared to internalize the truth entirely. Her pain had become the fire of her final authority. Mary became the bearer of the only real hope that each individual can find their own wholeness, even in a world that demands fragmentation. She became the messenger of the inner divine. Her certainty was unshakable because it was self-generated. The collective shadow that once condemned her could not touch her anymore. She had integrated her own shadow. She was wholeness walking. Mary had completed the deepest of transformations. But carrying wholeness in a fractured world was a burden. The legacy of feeling she held could not be absorbed by the rigid, dogmatic structure of Jerusalem. Her mission now was to plant the seed of wholeness in a soil where it could grow. She needed to travel to a land where the sacred feminine could still flourish, far from the tight grip of Logos. She had become the free woman who carries truth across the world. She had become the messenger of wholeness. Her body was safe from control, her soul free from external dependence. Yet carrying this wholeness in a world built on fragmentation was unsustainable. To preserve the purity of her gnosis, she required one last act of separation. Her destiny called her to the sea, toward the search for a place where the self could finally bloom. Mary had reached wholeness. Yet carrying that wholeness in a world still imprisoned by fragmentation, by the collective shadow, was impossible. To protect the purity of her gnosis, her direct knowing of the soul, she required one final act of separation: the solitary journey. This journey, preserved in apocryphal legends, is the psychological epilogue of her story. Mary leaves not out of fear, but out of spiritual necessity. Her body and her message could not be absorbed by the rigid, dogmatic structure of Jerusalem. She needed to travel to a land where the sacred feminine could still breathe, far from the dominion of Logos. Jung saw the solitary journey as the critical phase of individuation, the moment when the individual must prove that their wholeness is strong enough to exist without the support of the collective. For Mary, this meant boarding a boat with no destination, trusting only the intuitive principle she had reclaimed. This act was the materialization of her final freedom. She was not fleeing, she was choosing to be her own authority. She became living proof that true healing does not come from the outside, but from the courage to stare into the void and find the self there. According to legend, Mary's destiny carried her to the shores of what is now France. The symbolism is immense. The sea represents the collective unconscious, the womb of creation, the domain of the primordial feminine. Mary was surrendering herself to the realm of her anima, leaving land-bound reason to follow water-bound intuition. She brought no scrolls, no rules, only the legacy of feeling. Her mission was not to convert nations, but to plant the seed of wholeness in soil where it could flourish, among cultures where the feminine principle still held reverence. She became the bridge between the wisdom of the East and the chthonic energies of the West. By living as a pilgrim, she embodied integration. She used strength, her integrated animus, to navigate, but relied on intuition, her integrated anima, to choose her path. Her living existence became a living prayer, the proof that final healing is self-generated and immune to persecution. Her final legacy is not only the quest for the self, but the legacy of the shadow. By accepting her past, the pain, the guilt, the repressed silence, and folding it into her future as the wise one, she taught us that redemption is not the denial of the dark, but its inclusion. Wholeness is only achieved when we recognize the divinity inside our humanity, with all its wounds and all its radiance. Her solitary journey, far from being exile, was the embodiment of her ultimate freedom. Mary had completed the work. She gifted us the legacy of the shadow and the sacred feminine. Now her story becomes a mirror for ours. She left us the key, not a golden key, but a key of radical acceptance. But a key must be used. She carried her wholeness into the unknown. And now comes the question that echoes back to us. What will you do with the truth she left behind? Mary's journey ends where all true journeys begin, inside us. She left us a key, not a golden key, but a key of radical acceptance. Mary, bearer of the liberated sacred feminine, taught us that the greatest danger is not the judgment of the world, the collective shadow, but the judgment we turn against ourselves, the denial of our own Eros, our feeling, our intuition. Her legacy is not meant to be admired from afar, it is meant to be lived. The wholeness she reached is our own self, waiting to be uncovered. Her story becomes the mirror that asks, which part of you did society force into hiding? Which power did you exile into the shadow just to be seen as appropriate or strong? Mary's wisdom condenses into a single psychological command: accept the shadow. Not to be punished, but to reclaim the strength it guards. Your tears, your anger, your vulnerability, these are the language of your soul. Strength is never born from repression, but from wholeness. Mary proved that true authority belongs to the one brave enough to be human, And this humanity is the union of reason and heart. She is the living evidence that the final healing is spiritual autonomy. You are your own authority. You are your own proof. If Mary's story touched the shadow you carry, if you feel called to reclaim your voice and your inner wholeness, your soul work, your shadow work begins now. Subscribe to Shadow Work Stories and tap the bell so you don't miss the next archetypal journey. Our channel isn't just about stories, it's about turning pain into wisdom and transforming what was silenced into voice. Leave your like if you also believe in the power of wholeness, and click the video now on your screen to continue diving into the journey of the self. And remember, your self is waiting. Wholeness is your destiny.